Imagine it's 1989 and Batman is a global phenomenon, changing the way we look at superheroes forever. But while the Caped Crusader was dominating the box office, another dark, brooding Marvel anti-hero was making his live-action debut in film that most people wouldn't actually see for a few years. It's a movie that features a leading man at the heights of his action star powers, a budget that allowed for some truly impressive practical carnage, and one glaring omission that still drives comic book purists absolutely crazy. And I'm talking, of course, about the 1989 version of The Punisher. This film is caught between the hyper-violent action era of the 80s and the growing pains of the modern comic book movie. Today we are diving deep into the sewers of Sydney, Australia to uncover the bizarre production, the missing skull, and the cult legacy of the first time Frank Castle ever picked up a gun on the big screen. Before Frank Castle was a cinematic anti-hero, he was a guest star created by writer Jerry Conway and artist John Romita Sr. with Ross Andru. The Punisher first appeared in the pages of The Amazing Spider-Man number 129 back in 1974. He wasn't exactly a hero. He was a disciplined, lethal antagonist, a Vietnam War veteran driven mad by the mob-ordered execution of his family. Throughout the 70s and early 80s, he popped up across the Marvel Universe, usually clashing with Daredevil or old Spider-Man over the refusal to use lethal force. But by the mid-80s, the dark age of comics had arrived and audiences wanted grit. Frank Castle transitioned from a supporting player to a solo superstar with a hit miniseries in 1986, followed by an ongoing series that solidified him as Marvel's premier urban vigilante. This surge in popularity happened right as independent film studios were looking for the next tough guy franchise to compete with the likes of Rambo and Commando. In the late 80s, the landscape of comic book movies was essentially a wasteland. Superman was on life support after the disastrous fourth entry, and Marvel was really struggling to get anything off the ground. Let's face it, their track record wasn't great, consisting of a low-budget Spider-Man and Captain America TV movies, and let's not forget the legendary flop that was Howard the Duck.
This is beginning to seriously undermine my self-esteem.
But enter New World Pictures. At the time, New World actually owned Marvel Comics between 1986 and 1989, making them the precursor to what we know now as the MCU. They saw the Punisher as a low-risk, high-reward property because, unlike, say, the X-Men or the Fantastic Four, Castle didn't require expensive special effects. He just needed a leather jacket, a big arsenal, and a lot of ammunition. To bring this version to life, they hired Boaz Yakin, I hope I got that right, to write the script with Mark Goldblatt to direct. Now, Goldblatt was already a legend in the industry, and not necessarily as a director. He was the powerhouse editor behind the action masterpieces, which I didn't know this, The Terminator and Commando. With a budget of roughly $9 million, production headed to little old Australia to make this Marvel movie that felt more like a hard-boiled yakuza thriller than a superhero flick.
What?
Yakuza, Japanese mafia.
Casting the titular vigilante was probably the most crucial step, and they landed on Dolph Lundgren, fresh off his iconic turn as Ivan Drago in Rocky IV and his stint as He-Man from He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Lundgren He was a physical specimen. He stood at 6'5", and he also had a martial arts background. And he also brought this real quiet, brooding intensity to the role. He famously did most of his own stunts and even stayed in character on set, looking increasingly disheveled as the shoot progressed. Joining him was the legendary Louis Gossett Jr. as Jake Berkowitz, Frank's former partner, and we have Jerome Crabb as the villainous Giangi Franco. I hope I got that right too. But there was one massive controversial decision that made during the development of this movie that still haunts this film's reputation to this day, and that's the removal of the iconic skull shirt. Now, director Mark Goldblatt later explained that he wanted the film to be more grounded and realistic. He felt a giant glowing skull on his shirt was too comic booky for the gritty crime drama he was trying to make. Instead, Frank wore simply black leather outfits, leaving fans wondering how you could have a Punisher movie without the character's most famous visual trait.
In retrospect, it was a poor choice.
The story itself skips the traditional origin tropes, picking up 5 years after Frank Castle had already begun his war on crime. He's living in the sewers, having already racked up a body count of over 120 mobsters. The plot kicks into gear when the Italian mafia is weakened enough by Frank's crusade that, yep, the Japanese yakuza, led by the cold and calculating Lady Tanaka, decides to move in and take over Sydney. I mean, an unnamed American city, his underworld, to force the mob's hand. The yakuza kidnaps the children of the mafia bosses. This creates a fascinating moral crossroads for Frank. He hates the mob, but he won't stand by while innocent children are used as pawns. This leads to an uneasy and temporary alliance between the Punisher's greatest enemy, Giangi Franco, resulting in a bloody high-octane finale in a Yakuza skyscraper. It's less about saving the day and more about who's left standing when the smoke clears. When it came time to release the film in 1989, things kind of went south pretty quick. New World Pictures was facing severe financial difficulties and it ended up being sold because of the corporate shake-ups. The film's theatrical release in the United States was unceremoniously cancelled. While it saw a theatrical run in Europe, Japan, and Australia, American fans wouldn't get to see it until it landed on VHS back in 1991 through live home video. Because it bypassed the theaters in the US, it never really got the chance to be the box office hit it could have been. Now, look, critics at the time were less than kind, dismissing it as just another mindless, ultra-violent action movie in a decade that was already full of them. They criticised the lack of comic book accuracy with the costume and the grim tone. However, the international audiences, they were a bit more receptive, and over the decades the film has found a second life on the shelves of video rental stores, where its dark aesthetic and relentless pace earned it a dedicated cult following. The production of The Punisher is filled with fascinating what-ifs and oddities, like, for starters, did you know the film originally featured a much longer opening sequence? I know I didn't. The work print version of the movie contained 15 minutes at the start of the movie showing Frank Castle as a police officer before his family is murdered, providing a much more traditional setup that was ultimately cut from the film's release to keep the focus on the urban legend version of the character. There was also rumours for years, probably back before the internet really hit, that there was a version of the film existing where Dolph Lundgren actually wore the skull shirt, but those have been debunked. The closest we got to a skull-shaped design was actually on the pommel of his knives. Now, another fun bit of trivia is that the film features an increasingly high body count. Depending on how you count it, Frank kills around 76 people on screen. That's a pretty decent body count for action movies of that time. For physical media collectors, The Punisher has had an interesting journey. After the initial 1991 VHS release, which featured the iconic cover of Dolph on his motorcycle, the film made its way to DVD in the early 2000s, usually as one of those budget titles, unfortunately. So for a long time, the film was kind of stuck in some licensing limbo in the United States. But however, international fans got the royal treatment. And the first time was in Germany. A massive Ultimate Edition was released on Blu-ray, featuring multiple cuts of the film, including the unrated version and the exclusive work print. It wasn't until more recently that boutiques labels like Umbrella Entertainment here in Australia released high quality Blu-ray versions, like I have here, that finally gave the cinematography the respect it deserves. Now, while we haven't seen a mainstream 4K HD release yet in the States, the cult demand remains high and the film continues to be a staple for fans of that 80s Cannon style action cinema.
Lots of quick random action.
Okay, this movie has a very special place in my heart, as this movie is my origin story. And if it wasn't for this movie, I don't know if I would have this collection behind me or be into comic books and superheroes like I am. So look, in 1991, I was about 16 and I was a massive action movie fan, like most teenagers were at that time. And I saw this new movie, The Punisher, at my local video shop for rent. And I was like, hey, that's Dolph Lundgren from Rocky IV and Masters of the Universe. And I was like, I have to check this out. I watched the movie and I loved it. I can't remember exactly how I found out about this, but I saw that it was from a comic book. So about a week later or so, I went down to my local newsagents and I bought my first Punisher comic, which was issue number 45. And that was it. My life hasn't been the same since. I had the bug after that and I have never looked back. So for me, this is more than just a movie. For me, this is a pivotal moment in my life that changed it forever. Sure, it's a movie of its time. There's no two ways about it. And look, it's got some shortcomings, but it's a moment in time for me that every time I watch it, it just takes me back in time. Look, I can't give this a fair score. I really can't. For me, this is a 10 out of 10. But if I had to give it a legitimate score for the movie, its actual self, look, I'd probably give it a 6 out of 10. But for me, there's just too much sentimental value wrapped up in this movie for me to give it anything other than a 10 out of 10. Looking back on the 1989 Punisher, look, it occupies a strange, lonely place in Marvel history. It arrived long before the polished formula of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and even predicated the leather and chrome era of the early 2000s. Now, while Thomas Jane, Ray Stevenson, and John Bernthal would all later put their own spins on this character, all with the skull shirt, mind you, Lundgren's version remains the most distinct in its atmosphere. It feels more like a noir film disguised as a slasher movie, where the slasher is actually the hero. It didn't change the world and it didn't start a massive franchise, but it proved that Marvel characters could work in an R-rated adult setting. It's a gritty, sweaty, unapologetic piece of genre filmmaking that captures the very specific moment in time when comic book movies were still trying to figure out exactly where they were supposed to be in the film industry. Now look, whether you're a die-hard Marvel fan or just a lover of 80s action films, it's a film that deserves to be revisited, if only to see Dolph Lundgren meditating naked in a sewer while talking to God.
Here is justice. Here is punishment. Here
Next week on the show, we are going to look at what I picked up for February 2026. I got some great titles to show you, so I can't wait for that one. Thanks for watching.